A reading from the first book of Samuel. In those days Hannah conceived, and at the end of her term bore a son, whom she called Samuel, since she had asked the Lord for him. The next time her husband, Elkanah, was going up with the rest of his household to offer the customary sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vows, Hannah did not go, explaining to her husband, "Once the child is weaned, I will take him to appear before the Lord and to remain there forever. I will offer him as a perpetual Nazirite." Once Samuel was weaned, Hannah brought him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and presented him at the temple of the Lord in Shiloh. After the boy's father had sacrificed the young bull, Hannah, his mother, approached Eli and said, "Pardon, my lord. As you live, my lord, I am the woman who stood near you here, praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord granted my request. Now I, in turn, give him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be dedicated to the Lord." Hannah left Samuel there. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
A reading from the letter of St. John. Beloved, see what love the Father has bestowed on us, that we may be called the children of God. And so we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we shall be has not yet been revealed. We do know that when it is revealed, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Beloved, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence in God and receive from him whatever we ask, because we keep his commandments and do what pleases him. And his commandment is this: we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he commanded us. Those who keep his commandments remain in him, and he in them. And the way we know that he remains in us is from the Spirit he gave us. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Each year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up according to festival custom. After they had completed its days, as they were returning, the boy Jesus remained behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know that. Thinking that he was in the caravan, they journeyed for a day and looked for him among their relatives and acquaintances, but not finding him, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions, and all who heard him were astounded at his understanding and at his answers. When his parents saw this, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been looking for you with great anxiety." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. He went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. And his mother kept all these things in her heart. And Jesus advanced in wisdom and age and favor before God and man. The gospel of the Lord. So, medical survey, don't worry, we won't violate HIPAA. Does anybody here, other than I, have Dupuytren's contractions? Dupuytren syndrome? I don't have anybody, and not a single person. This is violating the national norm. Dupuytren's is a situation that you get, and it makes your hands shrivel up like this, so you end up with little crab claws like this. But they do a resection. You go into the hospital, they cut a resection. But what happens is the tendons in your palm that lead to your fingers, they all shrink up, and it gradually contracts like that, and then you get it fixed, and it gets better. I was disappointed when I found out that I had it. It runs in families, and it runs rampant in our family. Not as bad in ours as in a group of cousins. My family of origin is 5 boys and 3 girls. We have another family on the West Coast, a family of cousins, 5 boys and 3 girls. What are the chances? I think 6 of them, or 5 of them, have had to have the resectioning, right? So it's just an annoyance, it's a pain, it's time out from work, it's all that kind of stuff. My disappointment when I found out about it, I've had the starting syndromes for about 10 years, then it just stopped. Lucky me. But the reason I was so disappointed was when I read one of those cheesy brochures at a doctor's office. The guy said, "Here, you have Dupuytren's. Here's the little brochure to tell you all about it." And it was very poorly worded. It was very, very poorly worded. It was redundant. It was it lacked compassion. It was all those things. It said, Dupuytren most frequently strikes like it's going to kill you. Dupuytren's most frequently strikes elderly white men descended from Norwegians or other Vikings. Elderly? I mean, when did 48 become elderly, right? So that was a little bit of a setback. And it was like next week, the guy said, "Do you want a senior ticket to the movie?" I thought, it's really getting bad. But the Viking part, you know? And I announced this to the class. I said, I just found out I'm part Viking. And they just had a rough quiz, and they said, "Makes perfect sense to us." Like I was coming after them, right? I was going to knock them out or something. But what's the Dupuytren's got to do with the readings today? It's this. Among the people in the extended family who've had the Dupuytren's resectioning, it's a funny darn thing that so many of them have had it. And my mom was the first one I know who had to do it and then do it. Fortunately, we have a cousin who's a hand surgeon. It really works. She had to do it, but then she rescheduled it because it conflicted with some family stuff. And I think it would have been easier for her if she had just stuck to the original schedule. But she said, "You know what? It's going to be a big pain for everybody else to have me with my hands all." She was going to get both of them done, I think, or one, and then the other one immediately afterwards. She said, "It's going to be very inconvenient for a lot of people if I get this done right now, so I'm going to put it off." Well, you really shouldn't put it off. I know. And then as it turns out, the word was that when some of the cousins out on the West Coast in Oregon, when they had their procedure scheduled, they too ran into family conflicts and said, "You know what? I'm going to postpone it." One of them found out that she was supposed to babysit for her grandchildren. Her son and daughter-in-law were going to go away. She had said she would babysit, and it would be really hard to chase little kids with your hands in a cast, right? Somebody else was going to help his family members move, and then he said, "Well, no, let me reschedule this process." So for a bunch of Vikings, it's actually quite flattering, isn't it? That they start to think of what's good for the us rather than for just me. There was one exception. I think he's not related. I think it was an in-law, and it might just be urban myth. A guy who really didn't want to go to a family wedding, so he scheduled his procedure for the morning of the wedding. So you can use it either way. But all those people who said, "You know what? Let's do it at a time that's more convenient for the bigger crowd." They weren't focused on what's good for me. They were focused on what's good for us. And there's a major piece of the story in the readings today. Comparing people who say it's all about me versus people who think it's really got to keep an eye on the us here, even when it's inconvenient. And so in the first reading today, we get sort of, it's just archetypal, good guy, bad guy stuff. There are 2 families in play in the first reading. The family of Elkanah, whose name was mentioned, the family of Eli, whose name was mentioned in a minor role. Elkanah's family, with the me people and the us people. Elkanah was back in the days when the children of Israel could have more than one wife. You know, Jacob had a bunch of wives and Joseph had a bunch of wives. Anyhow, Elkanah had 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Peninnah from what I understand, is no relationship to the family that invented the grilled sandwich. None at all. That was her cousin Panini, not Panina. Huh? And she was kind of mean. She was, in fact, not kind of mean. She was very mean. The deal was that God had blessed her with children. She had 2 or 3 kids with Elkanah, and she was supposed to be sort of the junior varsity wife, the way they organized things in those days. But she had children, and that was a sign of God's great approval and God's blessing. And poor Hannah, she couldn't conceive, and she was going into her old age. She went to the temple up in Shiloh. She prayed and prayed and prayed to the point where Eli, the priest, thought that Hannah was drunk because she was praying so energetically and fervently, and the tears were coming down. They had to clarify things. Eli blesses Hannah. Hannah continues to pray. The Lord grants her a child. The child is Samuel. Samuel, as Old Testament characters go, Samuel's a really big deal. Samuel is the one who anointed who anointed Saul and then anointed David. Samuel is the one who, with Eli, that famous part of the scripture where it says, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." That was Samuel as a baby. So Samuel had a big impact. But the deal was that his mother, probably, as we would sort of infer, she probably wanted to raise the kid at home, right? Because Penina is so wicked and so awful all the time. But she thought, what's best for this child and what's best for all of us, therefore, is if and somebody after the last Mass said, is this like Old Testament baby dumping? No, it's not. She took him to the temple at Shiloh as a Nazirite. That is, she dedicated him to the Lord. You can either be a temporary Nazirite or a perpetual. It says right here, he was a perpetual Nazirite. What's that mean? He was going to be in the service of the Lord's people for his whole life. And he never cut his hair, he never ate grapes, and he never touched dead people. Who came up with those limits, right? But he was a Nazirite. And there are other famous Nazirites. In addition to Samuel, we have Samson with the hair, right? And he pulled the pillars down, the whole thing collapsed. What Hannah did there was a great act of us. What Hannah did there was a great act of, it might be my inclination to think of me and my gratification and my war with Penina, but that's not what God is asking. And what's best for Samuel is if he does live a life as a Nazirite. And so she made that great big us choice. As opposed to Penina, where the bad music plays whenever she walks into the room, who was always about making other people miserable, promoting her own status, making herself look good. Meanwhile, off on the side, Eli, there's another gap in that family. Eli, clearly dedicated to the service of the Lord, and he wants what's best for his community and for his family. He has these 2 dud sons. I mean, capital D-U-D, dud sons. Their names are Hophni and Phinehas. I will never forget their names. Those were the 2 names I couldn't come up with on an Old Testament exam about 25 years ago, and I will always remember Hophni and Phinehas. Hophni and Phinehas were JV priests in the temple at Shiloh. What they would do is when people came to bring the meat to be sacrificed, like slit the goat's throat as it happened in today's first reading, they would steal the meat out of the pot. That's how low down Hophni and Phinehas were. When people came to make offerings, they would pilfer from the offering pot. They would take advantage of all sorts of people. Eli was all about Hophni and Phinehas, you got to clean up your act. And they never did. And it broke Eli's heart, and they never cleaned up their act. They were so concerned about their self-indulgence, they didn't want to think what was good for their father. And so we get Penina and Hophni and Phinehas in this corner, and we get Hannah and Eli over in this corner. This is the it's all about me crowd. This is it's all about us. In the gospel today, the story takes sort of an interesting turn because it's not always as simple as Hophni and Phinehas, those types, versus people who think about us. Sometimes it's competing notions of us in the gospel. Inspired notions. Lots of people coming from a really good place, not thinking about how do I promote my own cause or make more money or do something. This is people who are thinking what's good for us and other people thinking what's good for us, and they don't line up exactly. And so the story with the Holy Family, as you know so well, the caravan was in motion. Please, if you're thinking about this, really thinking about it for the first time, don't think of it as something as simple as, Mary's driving, Joseph's in the back seat, and the baby seat is empty and nobody notices. That's not the way it worked, right? They would have been traveling with dozens, probably hundreds of people. They would have seen Jesus hanging out with his cousins or his distant relatives or the other people of Nazareth and thought, everything's fine. He's somewhere in the crowd, I don't know how it was with you. Our family was like that a lot. They're back there someplace. Don't worry about it, right? Turns out they're 2 states away. But generally, don't worry about it. And then they went just to make sure, and he wasn't there, and they go back. And what is it that Mary says to Jesus? Your father and I have been searching for you with great anxiety. Why? Because they love him, and they love their family. They want their family to be sort of a holy and a serene family. Funny thing in the scripture, when it says your father and I, it's a small f, father, right? So Mary's perceiving we got to do what's best for us, Jesus, and you're not understanding this. One could construe his choice as an act of great self-indulgence. He's going to hang out and dazzle the teachers in the temple. But he wasn't doing that. Just as Mary and Joseph were coming from a great place of us, so Jesus was coming from an interesting and inspired place of us as well. And he says, didn't you understand I had to be in my Father's house, capital F, Father? And Mary and Joseph didn't quite get it, but they did trust that he was coming from a good place. And so they took him home, and the mysteries continued to unfold. But there we have that situation. Mary and Joseph were coming from a really good place. Jesus was coming from a really good place. And it led to some sadness between them, right? It led to some misunderstanding. It led to some disappointment. So there's no guarantee that even if everybody is out of the Hophni and Phinehas camp and into the us camp, it's not always going to be easy, right? And so you look at it, I hope, in terms of your own family and your own existence. And however you construe family, there's no, in order to be family, you have to look like Donna Reed. No, it's not that. Could be your immediate family, could be your extended family, could be a traditional family, could be a less traditional family. Family, you have probably a pretty good idea of what that means to you these days. So I'd ask you to notice those moments when God gave you the grace to get out of Hophni and Phinehas' corner. Huh? Has there been a time when you were thinking for yourself, this is what I need to do for me, either professionally or financially or relationally or something else, and not paying such great attention to the us, and then you got around to the us? Teenagers especially, I'd ask you to think about the ways in which your recreation, your academics, your athletic pursuits, your friendships, all that other stuff, ask you to keep an eye on the us of the family, not just what do I want to do, what's going to be good for me, what's going to give me the biggest kick. And I know you're good at it, at asking us questions rather than just me questions. But I'd ask everyone to notice 2 or 3 times in your life when a lesser person might have put the emphasis on me and your hopes for yourself, but God gave you the grace to focus on us and your hopes for the whole group. And it might have been very inconvenient for you, or it might have been sort of sad for you. It might have been easier if you hadn't gotten involved, but you did, and it was the right thing to do. You could have headed for the hills, and you didn't. When have you made that move from me to us, or conversely, avoided the temptation to me when you were in that us place? The second thing, when have you gone from us to a better us? That is, you were coming from a place and you were thinking of what's good for the family, and you had an idea, and someone else had a different idea, but you knew they were coming from a good place. And so you worked it out, or you synthesized it, or you deferred. When has that been your experience, right? Both experiences, from me to us, or from us avoiding the temptation to me, and from us to a better us. Caveat, I appreciate fully that people in church today have had family experiences where there was completely inadequate focus on the me, right? That happens sometimes. And I'm not talking about some sort of abusive situations that call you to completely, evaporate yourself in the process of helping. That's not what this is about. There are certain circumstances where me is the inspired response. What I'm getting at here is the more typical situation that you have to adjust, where the us is the more inspired response. Me to us, when did you do it? Us to better us. When did you do that? And I know you've done it. Even if you're not descended from Vikings, You've surely made those choices several times. What's your story? So, yeah, I get it. Sometimes in families there are unfortunate circumstances where you need a little bit more me. Like, take care of yourself and worry about what's good for you. And I also get it that in the typical situation, it's most always going to be an inspired move to say, gosh, am I too stuck on me, and not enough aware of us? Are my hopes too much wound up in my personal notion of the good rather than the communal notion for the family and what's good for the other individuals? So going from me to us, and then sometimes, right, there are different views that are all inspired. They're all coming from a good place of us. But they don't exactly line up, like Joseph and Mary on the one hand and Jesus on the other. So when have you had to acquiesce? When have you had to defer? Say, you know what? Your idea is probably a better one when it comes to work or play or friends or vacation or the way to discipline or the way to have high goals or the way to whatever else it is. Me to us, us to a better us. When have you made each of those steps, and what does that say about the way God works in your family? However you construe it. Let us pray.